morning to all of you. Thank you very much, Anne, for introducing me. And first of all, we are all extremely grateful that you set up this technology and the basis for this winter school. Otherwise, we would have been in Strasbourg, and which would have been much nicer, of course, than just chatting via Zoom. But this is the best compromise we could find. So thank you all. Also from my side, I'm really sort of cordially inviting you to listen and to discuss with us the different topics that we are now dealing with over the next 4 to 5 days. My name is Kai Vogeley. My background is in medicine and philosophy, and we had a couple of years ago indeed the idea, so essentially it goes back to 2 years now, together with a team of the principal investigators, and you will find them all on the webpage, so I don't have to tell you all the different names, but I will show you the different institutions which are contributing to our consortium. The idea to study time experience, and we were following a call from the European Union Horizon 2020 program in a FET proactive project, and this is essentially what we are now talking about, and this is one activity, this winter school within this consortium. Okay, so Anne Giersch told you already, so the name of the project is Virtual Times, Exploring and Modifying the Sense of Time in Virtual Environments. So this is the ambitious goal of the whole project. Funding scheme, as I told you already, FET Proactive in Horizon 2020 framework. These are the different institutions that are participating and that are contributing to the scheme and to the project. This is first of all the Cognitive Neuropsychology Department by Anne Giersch and her colleagues. Okay, so this was, I was already introducing Anne Giersch to you from the Cognitive Neuropsychology Department in Strasbourg. We have an industry partner, Psys, and they will also tell you what they are doing. Namely, they are sort of commercializing and studying applications of virtual reality therapies in the framework of psychopathology and psychiatry and psychopathology conditions. So this is extremely interesting. One of the cores of the whole project, of course, is the University of Würzburg, where the computer scientists are working, and they are sort of generating for us these virtual reality environments, and you will be informed about that over the next couple of days. Mark Wittmann, together with Anne, they are the, let's say, psychology backbones of the whole project. So they are extremely well educated about time psychology. Mark Wittmann is affiliated to this so-called Institute for Frontiers in Psychology in Freiburg. And last but not least, our friends from the University of Helsinki, who are helping us to get all the different data streams together, who are experts in different psychophysiology parameters, etc. I myself, with my team, I'm affiliated to the research center in Jülich, and as a secondary affiliation also to the University Hospital of Cologne, where we do have access to different patient groups. Just to give you a couple of, let's say, intuitions that were sort of leading the constitution of the whole consortium. So I myself also have a philosophical background, so this is why I'm starting with some philosophical intuitions, and I hope this is fine and enriching the whole discussion that we will have over the next couple of days. Obviously, Kant is a very important philosopher who tells us that time is serving as a kind of internal sense. So time is nothing that can be empirically, as on its own, can be studied. It's not an empirical conception, so not a thing or a physical object that you can put on a table and bend your microscope over this particular object, etc., and study that. But it is what he's calling so-called Anschauungsform in German, a necessary representation that is lying at the foundation of all our intuitions. So all the different ideas, insights, perceptions that we might have to pass different kind of filters and have to be transformed according to a kind of coordinate system, and space and time are, let's say, the two different axes which are structuring our perceptions, our insights, our thoughts, etc. Time was referred to by Kant as the so-called internal sense, as opposed to space, which is, according to Kant, at least something entirely different, because this is the external sense. So space is related to the world outside, but time is, in a way, a psychological category, if you wish. Then obviously we have big, huge heroes in the history of time psychology and philosophy. So William James on the left-hand side, who was responsible for Principles of Psychology in 1890, as you all know. And William James is already bringing up the intuition that time is extended, so that we are not, if we are referring to the present, that we are not talking about a different point in time, but we are talking about a duration. We are constantly conscious of a certain duration, what he calls the species present, that can vary in length from a few seconds to probably not more than a minute, and that this duration is the original intuition of time. You might have heard that the current psychology is very much discussing the so-called 3 seconds window, so that our presence experience, so that the experience of the present, the experience of the moment of now, is extended in time, and that this can take up to a couple of seconds. In a way similar to that was also the argumentation by Edmund Husserl, who developed the phenomenology of the consciousness of internal time, or Phänomenologie des inneren Zeitbewusstseins, and he always refers to a melody as one of his key examples. I cite Edmund Husserl: if we hear a bit of a melody, we do not hear merely single tones, but we rather hear enduring tones, specifically tones combining into a tone formation, so what we usually would call a melody. And in the unitary regard, continuously directed towards it, we grasp the unity of the total perceptual appearance of this tone formation as something absolutely given itself. So the basic idea, or let's say the basic riddle that Husserl was confronted with, is that on the one hand side, at each particular point in time, we just simply hear only one particular tone of a melody. But on the other hand side, we have this melody, so to say, in mind. Yeah? So there is a continuity, and this obviously applies not only to music, but also to language-based utterances, etc., etc. So if we hear a sentence, for instance, we have the sense of what the speaker wants to tell us in mind, although it is extended in time and might be extended even over longer durations than just only a couple of seconds. So this is one of the basic intuitions that are brought into the debate by William James and Edmund Husserl, that we are probably talking, if we talk about time and the species present, that we are talking about an extended duration. Think about a particular extended duration that is sort of spanning itself on the physical time axis, and try to think, try to imagine that there are certain events, so certain experiences, certain words, certain tones, etc., that are presented during this particular time period. Then you can obviously estimate the duration of the physical event that under certain circumstances can quite nicely correspond, but which can also be very easily changed if you wish, in a way, distorted. So what has come into the, or sort of has become sort of important in the literature is, for instance, one particular example of this way of how experiences can be easily kind of changed or distorted is referred to as the time-emotion paradox. So try to imagine that you have a time period, or let's start with what I would call filled time. So think about just a couple of days of this winter school that are hopefully entertaining, hopefully amusing in a certain way and intellectually stimulating for you. And then this particular period of time is filled with lots of different informations. And the interesting observation is that persons who are asked to estimate the duration of such a filled time period, they tend to underestimate this particular duration, as opposed to situations in which they are experiencing what one could call empty time. So a quite unamusing situation, or maybe even a boring situation. We are in the consortium doing experiments with waiting rooms, so where we simply let persons wait. An idea that Mark Wittmann brought into our debate. And then you can make the observation that time is overestimated. So obviously the emotional valence of the events and the experiences you have in these different time periods might change the way how you experience time and how you estimate the duration of time. It also depends whether you estimate beforehand, so in a kind of prospective way. So you are asked to estimate the time that you will experience later on. And it's an interesting observation there that the pre-estimation is something different from the post-estimation. Sorry, there is a typo here, so that should be post-estimation. So if it's studied later on, you come to different conclusions there. Time obviously also plays a role in the psychopathology domain. So David Vogel will now in the next talk will give you some examples of how we approach that on the basis of qualitative data analysis. And here I go back to Eugene Minkowski, who was in Le Temps Vécu, sorry, another typo here, sorry, a P obviously is missing, is talking about different psychopathology conditions, so which include melancholia, so nowadays we would rather talk about depression, which includes schizophrenia, and he makes, for instance, from a phenomenological perspective, the observation that the future of persons suffering what he's referring to as melancholic delusion, that the future is blocked, namely by the expectation of punishment or imminent death. The past congeals in the form of ideas of sin, so you've done something wrong in the past. As for the present squeeze between the errors of the past and the punishments of the future, it is reduced to nothingness. It is rejected in the form of ideas of impoverishment or negation. So this is what persons with depression, for instance, might experience. And one of the very, from my perspective, one of the very extreme cases is that persons suffering from depression might even experience that time no longer moves forward. So the flow of time has suddenly stopped. Time is standing still. And the only explanation that many of the persons suffering from depression with a standstill of time experience can come up with is the idea that they might be already dead and they have died already. So because this is the only explanation why this extreme, bizarre and weird experience that time is standing still, is no longer moving forward, can be explained. Yeah, and Minkowski obviously is one of the very famous and one of the very important heroes in the field of psychopathology that has been fueling our ideas and many of the empirical approaches that we are following. In one of the papers of David Vogel, so he will be the next speaker, we found it quite useful to differentiate, and this is also a key component of the whole grant proposal and of the whole consortium, to differentiate between what one could call structure and flow. So structure usually refers to what we all can remember as past, present, and future. so on a so-called macro layer. So with macro layer, we refer to any kind of experience that you can explicitly talk about. So that is accessible via descriptive phenomenology, that is accessible via qualitative research. So if you ask persons, if you talk to them, and David will continue on that issue, and he's sort of talked to a couple of persons from different diagnostic groups. So all these different things are describable or can be described and can be accessed on what we call a macro layer. On the micro layer, obviously, structure relates to retention, presentation, protension, which is essentially the terminology that Edmund Husserl brought into the debate. So the idea, namely, that at a certain point in time, I do only hear one particular tone, for instance, of a melody. So this is what Husserl would refer to as presentation. But at the same time, I'm still kind of listening or have in mind the tones that have been presented before. This is what he's referring to as retention. So you could possibly translate that with a psychological concept of working memory. Protension, though, is referring to the near future. As opposed to the idea of structure, we were also introducing the idea of flow. And the flow experience simply refers to the feeling that time is moving forward. So we all have now the experience that some time has already passed by since Anne said hello to you and since I was struggling with my technology at the very beginning. So sorry again for that. And time is sort of moving forward. Time is kind of flying away. So, and the more entertaining the talks you're listening to or the debates you're having, the more intellectually stimulating it is, the faster time moves forward. And this can be also obviously studied on what we call macro layer. So you can ask persons about that, but you can also on a micro layer, so which is usually implicit and no longer explicitly accessible by test persons, study by means of experimental psychology and of course cognitive neuroscience. And we will demonstrate and show you a couple of these different approaches during the next couple of days. This is now already the last slide. So this is again taken from the grant proposal, which shows you again as a kind of summary slide, the overall idea of the whole consortium. So I have been introducing a couple of intuitions of time experience that, and this might be the most important point for now from my particular contribution here, namely that time experience obviously is in a way fragile. So time experience can change depending on the content you experience, whether it's filled time or empty time. It can depend on psychopathology conditions, so it can depend on your emotion, etc. So it's both obviously state and possibly also trait dependent. It has not been sort of systematically studied whether you can modify time experience. And this is the essential idea that we had among all the different persons contributing to this consortium, that you could possibly, by presenting different versions of virtual reality, so where you see, for instance, either an empty context, so let's imagine this would be a waiting room and there is only one person in, as opposed to a filled waiting room that is quite crowded. You could also imagine that clocks are moving faster or slower in different contexts. You could think about natural phenomena that can change with the velocity. And these are all sort of so-called virtual zeitgebers that our colleagues from Würzburg are able to provide, and that can be systematically studied within the framework of this project. And yeah, a bit ambitiously, so that was one of the fun parts of writing the proposal, was inventing a name for this machine or for this platform, if you wish, and we called it metachrone, and we are arguing that metachrone can not only modify something like the density, so of the stimuli that you're seeing, for instance, in this waiting room, or in very rudimentary experimental contexts like a star field simulation, and velocity, but also things like synchronicity. So, which is studied essentially by Anne Giersch and her team in Strasbourg. Synchronicity would refer, for instance, to the concept of structure, velocity and density, much more to the concept of flow. And what we want to do is to measure different behavioral and also physiological signals, as we are just roughly in the middle of the whole project. We are not able to present very rich data and integrated data about different behavioral, physiological, and neural signal, but we have been able to obtain EEG data already, and this will be also presented during the next couple of days. And the idea is to combine all these different signals, feed it into this metachrone platform, and by this possibly sort of be able to modify the time experience of persons. And based on what persons are sort of experiencing in terms of psychopathology conditions, you can easily imagine that this could be potentially a very fruitful way to change the experience of persons suffering, for instance, from depression or suffering from schizophrenia. That is a focus of Anne Giersch and her team, etc. And by this, I want to close. I'm already reaching my my time slot, the end of the time slot.